Get down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Get down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Get down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Who's down with D&D?
This whole party.
Down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
You down with D&D?
Yeah, you know me.
I'm down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Who's down with D&D?
This whole party.
Hello there. Welcome to Down with D&D. My name is Sean Merwin, and let us get our game on, or at least talking about our getting our game on.
Woo!
With none other than Teos Abadia. Teos, how's it going?
It's going much better. This is a wonderful day. I feel a whole world better than I did last time we recorded. I'm still exiled from Portland, but the air is actually cleaner there, and I could return, and we will return at some point.
Breathing that fresh desert air.
I am breathing fresh desert air. There is the pool. I mean, when I am a refugee, I do it well.
Yeah, exactly. Well, hey, it's good that you can refugee in style.
Yeah, it is not a sob story. And today has been really positive for news that we'll get to.
Yeah. So let's get right to that news. The first bit of news was both you and I and hundreds, if not thousands of other people got a chance to play some D&D, watch some games, hear some news at D&D Celebration. And from everything I heard, just from the running of game side of things, it went very well.
Yeah, amazingly well. I think it was halfway through the first day, there were more than 1,000 players had gone through.
Mm-hmm. Right.
As I understand it, pretty much every table was sold out through the online system.
Right.
And we had a lot of DMs for that. So it was a huge success. Tons of people showed up. We had two adventures. One, the now it's third run of the intro that you wrote for Icewind Dale 10.0, Ice Road Trackers.
Correct.
Super awesome, super highly well regarded. Well done. The new intro 10-01, The Frozen North, written by Paige Laitman and Travis Woodall. That was really well regarded as well. Both give you kind of a series of short, fast, fun encounters that help you think through what it's like to be in this kind of Icewind Dale setting. And then the epic by you and Celeste.
Celeste Conowitch, yeah, it was written originally to be run in person, and it was then adapted to run online based on feedback from people who had experience running online epics.
It's really easy to take an epic written for in person and change it to online. You just need about 2 weeks of a bunch of us in a room banging at every aspect of it.
Yeah. And it's not even the adventure itself that is problematic. It's just getting everyone on task and on track with how the technology is going to work.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we could do a show just on that because it was fascinating to me. Like I would remark to my wife and to my kids, like, wow, it's hard to do this. Like it's hard to get everybody online and figure out how to make the interactivity work. But it worked. People loved it.
Right. And I mean, DMing takes certain skills.
Yeah.
DMing in person takes certain skills, and DMing online takes certain skills. I would not be able to run an epic online simply because once I am locked into DM, I am all about the players. And if something is going to interrupt me, I can't keep my eye on some channels.
Yeah.
If there was a loud dinging sound, I could do it. If there was someone screaming in my ear, then I would know, okay, it's time to stop. If the players told me, okay, it's time to stop, there's an announcement coming, I'd be fine. But I just don't have that sense of focus to be able to keep my eye on. I could keep my eye on 3 things at once. The 4th thing, you get me.
That was the hardest part because the epic had multiple semi-short pieces that needed to kind of run in order in a confined sequence. And so like a half hour has gone by, now do the next thing, or 20 minutes have gone by, do the next thing. And so you really had to track the time. And of course, what happened was at the very beginning, you have hey, could you copy my token into Roll20?
Right.
Is it okay if I do, I can't find the channel, my buddy can't find it. And you'd have to figure those things out and then adjust everything so you were back on the same schedule.
Right.
Whew.
Yeah, and we actually tried to make the very first thing that you do longer time wise than it needed to be. It was basically a 10 or 15-minute thing that could have been done in 3 minutes.
Yeah.
So we tried to even give time that, but even then, right, it all depends on the player. We tried to provide the players ahead of time some information about if you're in Discord and you need to get back to your table, here's how you do it.
Yeah.
So just to help with those sorts of things. But even then, it's technology. Everyone has a different level of familiarity. Everyone has a different level of comfort. So running online is a whole different animal.
But it was great.
And we,
I mean, can I just
Yeah.
say, like you have a knack for this, and Celeste as well, where the two of you wrote an epic that I think, like the best epics or opens, it has compelling combat situations, and certainly there was amazing excitement there. But it also kind of scratched other itches. It pushed for creativity in other ways. I don't want to spoil it because it'll run again online, but people were really enjoying those other things that they had to do, and the ways that it, brought them into almost LARPing, RPGing, and role playing in ways that you don't usually do, and those were really well done.
Yep. So it is. We ran it 3 times.
Yeah.
And now we have a few places where we know we need to sand down some rough edges. We will go back. We'll do a little bit of tweaking on it, and then it will be running at other places online and hopefully in person at some point in the not so distant, but definitely a little bit distant future.
Sure, let's go with that, John.
Yeah. And tables were run, as you know, in Spanish, as well as Italian, Portuguese, and German.
That's really cool. So that was the first time that we added Italian and German, I believe, to the mix. And combined with all the tables that ran in other languages at PAX Online, like this was a big weekend and week for international play. It was pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. It is great to have not just new voices in design, right?
Yeah.
New voices, but new voices getting involved as players in the community that we've known for 20 years plus.
And
so that's great.
It's also worth mentioning that tables were run at what we would call odd hours, but that is normal hours for the rest of the world. So we had DMs that were, like, I think in New Zealand that ran, so that to accommodate other areas of the world. Which is also, takes some planning and execution. And so it was really cool. There was a lot of work to make that happen. And I again want to thank Wizards of the Coast for wanting to do this, Baldman Games for wanting to do this. They both want this and take the steps to make it easier. And we keep talking about how to do more of this. I could go on forever about all the really cool conversations I had in my Spanish language tables about how much it meant to people. So I'll just say that.
Yep. And outside of the actual online play, there was a lot of other stuff going on. I didn't get a chance to see any of it because I was either working or getting ready to work or winding down from work. But there were streams. There was a website that had puzzles where you could unlock either information about some upcoming books or some certs to use with your characters. Did you catch any of those announcements?
So I didn't, but I got to see some people sort of oohing and eyeing about the website. So you can still go to the D&D Celebration website if you have the address, or if you look at our old show notes, you can go to it. It's still up. It doesn't have, I think, the puzzles connected, but it used to be you could interact with they have a neat map of Icewind Dale there, which is actually really cool and worth saving. Download that because it looks so nice. And you could click on it and then click on different places. You could sort of find puzzles, and you could do the puzzles, and those received some good reviews they were quite clever as to how you would do them. And then if you did them, you unlocked these downloads, and they have now placed, and we'll have the link in the show notes, the things you could get are now available there, so you can see them. It includes previews of the Barbarian Path of Wild Magic, the Genie Warlock, 2 tattoo wondrous items, 2 spells, one of which is very interesting because it's a spell, but it's psionics, Mind Sliver, wallpapers, and then a bunch of Adventures League certs that were pretty cool.
Excellent. And they did announce something about the 2021 schedule. Did you want to share what you heard about that?
Yeah. So in one of the very last session was with Liz Shu, who is kind of the bigger picture person that's above the D&D team. There's probably a great way to explain it, but that's how I think of it. Liz is awesome. I've met her before. And then also with Ray
Wininger.
Thank you, Wininger, who is the director of the team basically for D&D. And the two of them discussed where the team is and where they're going, and a number of other interesting design pieces. And the piece that kind of blew everyone's mind was where they said, we're going to revisit, in 2021, we're going to be emphasizing settings and revisiting 3 classic settings.
Wow. There aren't that many settings left that they haven't revisited already.
Well, and so this immediately started a lot of discussion on Twitter, and certainly my brain was
Spelljammer confirmed.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, you have to wonder, like, what are the ones, right? And to what extent, what they mean by this, right? Because it's one thing to say, like, we are releasing, Dragonlance as a setting. And I think when people think that, they tend to take every piece they ever loved about a setting and assume that all of that will be in a box.
Sure.
But it might not be that, right? Like, I mean, I think there was some marketing when Ghosts of Saltmarsh came out before it was announced what it really was, that said sort of, we're going to be visiting another setting.
Right.
Because that Ghosts of Saltmarsh is based in Greyhawk, but it is not the Greyhawk setting, right? It doesn't give you
for
that.
Sure.
And it doesn't scratch that entire itch. It just, it gives you some nice pieces about Keelan and so on. But so, maybe that's some of it too. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's a mix. Maybe there's an actual going back to a classic setting in a sort of full, robust way. Maybe there's something that's a little bit like Curse of Strahd, and maybe there's something that's a bit like Ghost of Saltmarsh.
Yeah, and it could be a card game or a board game for all we know.
Right. Yes.
Revisiting could be anything. It could be a set of minis that touch on something. So
who knows?
Yeah, but hey, at least those people that are clamoring for anything from those older settings, those classic settings.
We just finished reviewing
Theros,
right?
True.
And what do they announce? We're going to do another Magic the Gathering crossover coming. So which one will that be?
Right. Yep. So if you're a Magic fan as well as a D&D fan, you can start the speculation there.
And then you wonder. So they've announced. What was it? 2 weeks ago, I think they announced that Magic the Gathering will have a set that's a D&D set.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So how will that tie in? Will it be like, are they going to cross over from both sides and some, I don't know.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it was the Adventures in Forgotten Realms, right? Was what they called the Magic. So will there be a Magic setting for Dark Sun? How awesome would that be, right? Something like that. But we're getting way ahead of ourselves now.
Who knows?
And so D&D Celebration overall, from the inside, it went very well. The players that I got to interact with seemed to have a wonderful time. And the few bumps that were there, we know that we can smooth those out going forward, because this was a very big and quite complicated undertaking.
Yeah, but it feels like this works, right? Like if you think of just the number of people that showed up to the games, it's clear that an event like D&D Celebration reaches thousands and thousands of people. Mm-hmm. And those are the ones who'd played games. And I would say the games, maybe don't even have the most emphasis. If you just neutrally look at what D&D Celebration as a marketing thing is doing, that's a small part of it. And so then the number of people viewing things and interacting with the site, and this reaches a lot of people, and few gaming companies can do something like this. And this seems like we're going to see more of this from Wizards.
It would make sense. And what was most uplifting to me was, of the 6 tables I ran, probably 80% of the people were not Adventures League players.
Yeah.
Right. They may have never played Adventures League. They may have only dabbled in it, but they were still coming to play without even knowing what Adventures League was, or only having a modicum of a clue what it was. So that's great news as well. And speaking of great news, as we cover the expansion of D&D and of role-playing games, we like to keep track of new job openings, because that sort of gives us a clue on how fast this hobby, this business is growing. And a friend of the show and friend of ours, James Introcaso, announced just a day ago that he was going to become a full-time employee of MCDM.
That is huge news.
Yeah. Yep.
I mean,
you have a particular take on this.
Well, I do, because I think, historically speaking, the number of times that an RPG company adds a full-time employee is actually small.
Very small.
It's shockingly small. Like it will make you cry small if you think about it, in the perspective of the hobby. And MCDM hired James, who, any of us who work with him know how good he is. And know that he's a person who, for this to work, like it had to, like, this is a big deal. Like, it's not just like, hey, do you want to work? Sure. This is big. And what James offers to a company like MCDM is huge. And MCDM is saying, we're going to be hiring other people too. And that kind of growth mindset is something you don't see in sort of existing RPG, non-Wizards, non-Paizo companies. But I think we're seeing things change. There's sort of been this Paizo Wizards is huge, and they operate in a whole nother way than anyone else does. And we just finished talking about D&D Celebration, and it's a good example of it. A scale that no one else can touch, right? And then you've had long-standing or reasonably long-standing companies that are great, but they seem to be unable to really, really capitalize on growth. And then we've had Kickstarter as a way that helps them or creates these sort of other entities, but they're maybe not quite companies. And we're starting to see where suddenly crowdsourcing is enabling a new type of company to be created. And it can be media savvy and production savvy, and they can bring in big money. And I think this is the tip of the iceberg of how we're going to see a new era for the non-Wizard, non-Paizo company, and a new definition of what that is in the hobby, because there's money out there and there are ways to get it, and that can translate to employees with good jobs.
Yeah, and speaking of good jobs, the digital publishing section of Wizards has 2 new job openings, a creative lead and a narrative design lead. So, along with the 3 openings that are currently there that we've talked about in the past, that's a lot of game design work coming up.
And these 2 jobs are kind of interesting because they're for the digital publishing part. And so they seem to cross different areas, and they can deal with things like mobile games and a lot of different angles. So it's kind of fun. Like these seem like they could be really interesting jobs to have. Yeah.
Yep. If you are in the Seattle area or willing to locate to the Seattle area, there you go.
Yeah.
And a Kickstarter came to my attention, and it's along these same lines. The Kickstarter is called Grim Hollow, the Player's Guide. And it says it's the ultimate player's companion for making gritty characters in a dark fantasy setting. They just went live yesterday, and they're already up over $100,000. And this is a company that doesn't have a big name attached to it. They don't have a big following from before. They didn't work on this is a brand new company to RPGs, basically. Their previous Kickstarter raised over $250,000. That's the Grim Hollow setting. And here they are a day into this player's guide, and they're over $100,000.
Yeah.
It doesn't have Matt Mercer attached to it, right? It doesn't have Monty Cook attached to it. It doesn't have any big names, and yet there they are.
Right.
And so something like that, you can check it out. It's the Grim Hollow Player's Guide. You can go to there on Kickstarter and see what they have to offer. And again, it's a lot of minis, a lot of accessories if you want them, but also just the core game experience of this variation 5e dark fantasy campaign.
Really cool. And they have on the I think this Kickstarter also shows some examples of content. If you go and look at the Kickstarter, you can see the kind of things that they're offering with it. So it's kind of neat to just look at and peruse.
Yeah, and see what can still be expanded upon in a 5e game.
Yeah.
Yep. And speaking of Kickstarters, we wanted to call attention to the Skullkickers Caster Bastards and the Great Grotesque Kickstarter. A couple months ago, Jim Zub put out on Twitter something I never thought I'd see. Hey, I want some people to come work with me. Let me, private message me or reply if you're interested. Well, I'm sure 100,000 private messages or replies later, he was swamped.
Yeah.
But that Kickstarter is now up, and it is based on an old comic book, a story of monster smashing mercenaries caught in a whirlwind of adventure as they seek gold, glory, and good times.
Sweet.
So this Kickstarter will bring to you not just a 30-plus page comic book, but also a 60-plus page D&D campaign from game designers like Mike Olson, E.R.F. Jordan, and Clint Kroc, along with many still waiting to be announced. And Mike Olson was a DM for the D&D Celebration. We worked with him. He was there running with the rest of us.
Yeah,
and I know that he's on your blog a lot.
Yeah, he leaves comments on the blog. We've gamed together at Winter Fantasy. Show listeners.
He also worked on the Fate Core Handbook for Evil Hat, which is one of my favorite game books outside of the D&D world to just read over for great advice, great game design.
Yeah.
So you can check that out on Kickstarter. It's called Skullkickers.
Yeah, it's very cool. And Jim Zub is a really cool guy in the we can really now say in the industry. Right. You might in the olden days have thought like, well, he's a person who does comic books, sometimes D&D comic books. But no, this is the world we live in where we're all kind of integrated into this. And he's worked on a number of things that tie over into the D&D side too. He's got all those beginner books that he works on. Yeah. The intro books that are very popular.
Rick and Morty's box set he worked on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right, Rick and Morty.
So he's now established himself not just in the comic book world, but in the D&D world as well.
And kind of like we were saying before with other designers, this new world we live in, he doesn't have to just wait for the next Wizards of the Coast project. He can also do his own dreams through crowdsourcing. It's awesome to see. It's doing really well.
For sure. Yep. Another product that is on the horizon we want to mention is from the D&D Adventures League administrators. It is called Knuckleheads and Other Such Curiosities. It will be coming out, hopefully, in early October in both PDF and print form on the DM's Guild. Greg Marks has been tweeting about it on Twitter, as opposed to tweeting about it, I don't know, outdoors. But yes, tweeting about it on Twitter. You can follow him on Twitter at ScarrettTheGreen, but the is spelled with a 7 and a 3 instead of a T and an E for some reason. But he's been revealing bits about it. And the first things he said were this would involve 2 full-length D&D Adventures League adventures. One for Season 10, set in Icewind Dale, and one set in the Frostfell and playable in the Oracle of War Eberron campaign, if that's your juice.
Cool.
So, yep. And it will also contain a bunch of new monsters and spells and shorter encounters and subclasses and equipment and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So look for that at the beginning of October. Whew. Hey, you have a little bit of news. We talked about HeroQuest, and you were holding out on us, Teo Sabadell.
Turns
you
out
were holding out on us.
Yeah, and I thought I was going to have to hold out on everybody again because today on the day of recording, I knew that this would launch, but I had no idea whether it would include my name in it. And not all the details are out, and I can't say anything that's not public. But yeah, so last week we mentioned that Avalon Hill is now part of Hasbro versus being under the Wizards of the Coast section. And they have launched HeroQuest. They had this countdown timer website, and now it's out. And they have a Hasbro sort of crowdsourcing page that's running this thing for 45 days where you can go and you can get a new version of the HeroQuest game. Mm-hmm. And there are 2 options for what you get. You can get this basic set, or you can get the everything, which includes 2 expansions redone, old expansions redone. And then more minis and things like that. And then what they say are unlocks. And I think that's going to be slowly revealed what exactly is unlocked. But they say that Stephen Baker, who did original quests 28 years ago,
wow,
is back as a guest designer. And somehow, despite that being, he could have just done all of it. I am a guest quest designer.
Nice. So you got to the greatest thing about HeroQuest is Teo Sabadia working on it.
Yeah, right. Most certainly not. But I had a blast, and I again, I can't talk about what I did, but it was. This is the first time I've really been in like sort of the board game mind space as a designer.
Yep.
And it was really cool. So I
Yep.
look forward to being able to say more about it. They also announced other designers who worked on the Druid and Warlock characters, Nikki Dawes and Shauna Nakasone. They spilled the beans that Max Dunbar has done at least some of the new art. They have a ton of new minis. There's this whole video that's awesome that shows off all the incredible minis, including terrain, which I'm sure I'll be using in my D&D games.
There you go.
Yeah, and it's worth saying one of the listeners last week said, hey, you didn't mention the fact that in the olden days, this was a partnership. The original HeroQuest was made as a partnership with Games Workshop, and now it's all Hasbro. So it looks like, from what we can see, there's those Games Workshop elements have been faded out and renamed and so on.
Yep. So that is not on Kickstarter, but it is on a site called HasbroPulse.com, which is a crowdfunding site that looks like it's run directly by Hasbro.
That's kind of cool, right? Why don't you make your own crowdfunding site?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that makes sense because Kickstarter is wonderful, but Kickstarter gets a good chunk of your cash when you succeed. So I am not surprised at all to see this. It shocked me, but I was not surprised. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and it has done well. I originally put in the show notes like, raised 100K in like, I don't know, minutes or something, but it's more than 400K already. So it's with 45 days left, it's pretty safe to say it's going to reach its target and fund, and maybe it'll do a lot more than that. So we'll see what they announce with these unlocks.
Let's put it this way. 2 hours ago when I went to the site, it was at $100,000.
Yeah.
And 2 hours later, it's now at 400,000. So I think we know it's well on its way to over 1 million and probably much, much more beyond that.
Yeah, I'm excited for people to see the designs that we did. So it's cool.
I will be backing it. That's for sure. And speaking of minis, Teos, we're going to go to Teos's WizKids corner.
So, I mean, look, it's a little creepy that WizKids has somehow like attached a device to my brain and are stealing my ideas, because they just announced the hand and eye of Vecna as a collectible. They've had things like dragon heads, and somehow they stole my thoughts and created this. It is $130, but it is a 7-inch base, 10.5 inches tall, glass dome cover, and inside of this thing, as if you were in a museum, are displayed the severed hand of Vecna, and held between thumb and forefinger is the eye of Vecna.
Nice.
I mean,
yeah. I'm not a collector, but I think that is just completely awesome. If they had the head of Vecna, that would have been even better. But that's a whole other story. And what's this? The tower.
So $250, because why not? Gets you the tower, which is being released in November. This is a big, huge tower that is 3 levels, and you can take it apart so that you can play on each level. So you can reveal levels as you want and play on them. It has also removable windows, buttresses, stairs, and floors. The floor tiles are double-sided. I'm sure that kind of like the ship was. They're cardboard, I'm guessing, and you have a gridded side on one side, non-gridded on the other. 8 inches in diameter. Each level is just under 4 inches tall, so it's about a foot tall or so.
Wow.
I mean, very sweet. If you have the $250, I'm sure you'll have fun with it.
If you're a D&D collector, it's a great time to have a lot of money and to be able to spend it on things like this.
Yep. Yeah. No, I mean, these companies now know there are gamers with money, and you can reach out to them, and they will make it happen.
Yep. And we covered all of this, and PAX ended. Again, from everything I heard, it sounds like a lot of games were played, a lot of panels were viewed. If you want to watch the panel that Teos and I did, it is up on YouTube. It is called The Proper Care and Feeding of Your Franchise, D&D the AI Way.
Yep, we have a link to it in the show notes. You can go straight to where that one starts. But yeah, tons of
That's
really
right.
good panels there.
Yep, and of course, you can't get enough of us, so you want to go right from this podcast right there to hear another hour. But to get on to our main topic, I am excited to dig into the new D&D hardcover adventure and setting, Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frost Maiden. Just to warn you, this review, which will probably last at least 4 weeks, if not longer, because Teos and I tend to get thorough about the things we review, will be spoilerific. We are going to talk about it. We are going to talk about what happens in it. We are going to get right down into the nitty-gritty. So if you're a player and you don't like to have your adventure spoiled, you can still follow along, on our show with the news and stuff, but you might want to avoid the second half of our show for the next few weeks.
Yeah, because we want to dig into it. We want to make it useful to DMs and have perspective for the DMs and for the running of the adventure. So we're going to get into it and look at it from all the ways.
Yep. And the first one we want to talk about is on the credits page, because we can't help but notice that the authoring team and the world design team includes many freelancers working with WotC staff, several of whom were non-male.
Yeah.
Which is probably, other than something, well, for a Wizards of the Coast product, this is new.
Yeah.
There have been several high-profile things up on the DMs Guild, say.
Right.
But, for the most part, for a Wizards product, that is something new.
For anything,
and something exciting.
For anything with more than 2 writers, right? Because we've had products that are created by a female writer going back to early TSR days and all of that. But to have a project with more than 2 writers, we have majority non-male, is new, which is awesome.
Yep. And it's very exciting. For me as a player, it's exciting. For me as a design lead on projects, or as an editor, or as someone who oversees writing, this is exciting for me.
Yeah.
Because it gives me the hope and the desire to reach out to non-male, non-white people and know that we can get a great product out of it.
Yep.
So, what was the Canadian joke?
So, how Wizards has those disclaimers?
Yeah.
Every product has that little italics disclaimer, and this one is suitably funny, and it involves a joke about the knucklehead trout. And so Perkins is Canadian originally. And I imagine he's the person as head writer that he snuck in this knucklehead to the disclaimer.
Gotcha. Nice.
They snuck in the Canadian joke into the disclaimer, which I think is pretty funny.
That would, the Great White North, that you can't, I guess you can't have Icewind Dale without, a Tim Hortons somewhere in one of the 10 towns.
There are a lot of those types of jokes in the adventure. There are, and homages to the Thing are aplenty.
Oh yeah, for sure. So we're going to talk first about the pre-chapter 1 text, where they talk about the book organization, to show how deep we're going to delve into this. I think probably the rest of the episode is going to be covering before we even get to chapter 1.
Well, and I think, not only because you and I love details, we do, but it tells you a lot about a book, how you set it up.
Right.
And it gets you ready for how you're going to run this.
Right. As we've talked about time and time again, D&D adventures, D&D books are technical manuals. They're not novels. They're not short stories. They're technical manuals. And the most important part of a technical manual is its layout, how it's set up, how it delivers the information that it needs to get across to you as the reader. So that's why detailed focused Teos and I are going to really break this down. So the book starts with a non-chapter called Welcome to the Far North. And the first 5 paragraphs welcome you to the setting, and they give you a nice, concise, 10,000-foot view of the campaign, the setting, and the adventure. Yeah. Here's the tone. Here's the atmosphere. Here's kind of a quick rundown of what happens in this adventure. Boom. Perfect information for new or experienced DMs alike to just know that information. Did you have anything to say about that?
No, just I think it's if not as good as any adventure, it's better than other adventures in just how it does that. I think some of the adventures have tried to, for whatever reason, give you a taste but not a summary enough, and so you're still learning, and it like this does a good job of just telling you here's what's going to happen at a high level.
Right.
It's great.
One method of getting things across is you start, think of it as a funnel, right? You start with the 10,000 foot view, and then as you close in, you're just getting less general, more specific, and as the funnel gets smaller, your details get deeper and deeper. And that is something this book, I think, does pretty well. Words mean things. So I read a quote, and my first thought was no. And it's in a section called About This Book. It says, this book presents Icewind Dale as a self-contained campaign setting. Well, yes, kind of, but no. Right? If you are in the Forgotten Realms, you are not in a self-contained setting because the Forgotten Realms are so big. Right? They don't talk about every single god in the Forgotten Realms pantheon in here. So it's not really self-contained. The setting, yes, is self-contained, but there's still a lot of knowledge as a DM you're going to need to bring with you, particularly if you have players who want to use every single resource out there for their characters. Yeah. So just keep that in mind. It is a great self-contained setting, not necessarily a overall campaign book.
Yeah, and something we can look at it over time. You know, we talked about last time when we reviewed all the different elements of Icewind Dale in general. You know, does this book truly cover all of Icewind Dale to the depth do you want? Or do you still end up saying, oh, you should also buy Legacy of the Crystal Shard or look in other places? You know, do you need to go to the FR Wiki, right? We can kind of look at that over time, whether the depth is sufficient.
Yeah. That's a great idea. So we learn from a sidebar that the adventure is assumed to take place in the winter of 1489 or later.
Oh, man. That, you know, when I saw that, it got me going because, you know how I am about canon. And so 1489, wait a minute. I mean, the latest adventures have been in 1492. How is this not in 1493? Why we went back and then I have to go to my blog post where I dissected the history of recent products, and I go, this is so far back. I mean, it only feels like 3 years, but this makes it happen. The only adventures that happen earlier than Rime as the minimum is Out of the Abyss and Horde of Tiamat.
Right.
And potentially it happens even before Storm King. What? Like, it's like, why did they choose to do that, right? And you could just say, like, well, maybe they just wanted to say it's flexible. You know, any date after this works.
Right. Or
maybe this is truly meant to be as a thing that happened back then, right? Before I don't know, it's interesting, but I found it very fascinating. And at least as I quickly looked through the book, I did not see anything like, you know, ex-cultist of elemental evil or anything, you know, a traitor from Cholt. I didn't see anything like that would say, but wait, it has to be after this particular period of time. So it really does feel like 1489 or later, which is interesting.
Yeah. The thing that came to mind for me with that was one of the plots, which we're going to talk about, has to do with Asmodeus, which then made me think immediately of Descent into Avernus.
Yeah.
But I haven't read far enough in to know if there's any tie in there. Well, there shouldn't be, because supposedly this happened before that. Yeah. So who knows? And
I mean, Asmodeus is kind of, in some ways, like if you're going to go devils, it's Asmodeus, because Asmodeus heads up all of the nine hells. Yep. You know, it's a little easier to go with him than it is with the demon side, where like any one of them could be featured. So Asmodeus is your obvious big bag whenever you're dealing with devils. But Asmodeus has been dropped into products for a while now. I mean, like even in Candlekeep, right? Asmodeus, when we wrote Confrontation in Candlekeep during the D&D 5e playtest days, Asmodeus was behind that, right? And so Asmodeus certainly, it feels to me like the big bad that has their finger on the Forgotten Realms.
Right. It's the one big force that seems to be ever present but never touched, never stat blocked out and put into the adventure.
Yeah.
Whereas, if you want to do that, you throw Tiamat in, right? You
Right.
throw Orcus in. You throw these big bads that seem to always come up. But Asmodeus is never presented in that way.
You can't kill me because my stats aren't in this product.
Exactly. So, next we have an adventure summary, and it is less than a page, which is good, providing the three main plots of the adventure. The titles they're given are Duergar Despot, Netherese Necropolis, and Aurel's Everlasting Rime. So these are going to be the three major story arcs of this adventure, which you as the DM can pull out individually and run, or can weave together into a larger, more dramatic, more involved campaign. The high-level version of each of these plots is as follows. For Duergar Despot, Zardarak Sunblight is tricked by Asmodeus into trying to establish a hold over Icewind Dale as his own domain, and he will use Chardalyn as a tool to do that. The second is Netherese Necropolis. The Netherese sky city of Yithrin crashed here centuries ago, and now members of the Arcane Brotherhood are searching for it. And the third is Aurel's Everlasting Rime, which is sort of the overall setting plot, where Aurel's curse keeps Icewind Dale in perpetual darkness. Can the curse be lifted? So, as we don't want to get too deep into these yet, because we're going to talk about them in greater detail later, but as overall plots, what did you think about each?
These are really cool. I love them from a number of cases. So Duergar, this to me really evokes Legacy of the Crystal Shard. This is your Chardalyn corruption of ice left over from the old Crinchiniban artifact. It ties into the Drizzt Do'Urden novel series. Really evocative, really cool. Netherese Necropolis is a new element for Icewind Dale. The idea that the Netherese have a floating city that crashed here is that's new. But it ties in the old friends, the Arcane Brotherhood. That's pretty sweet. The other thing is, not to get too far into it, but I mean, this floating city involves a Mythalar. And that's some deep FR lore type stuff that players don't usually get to mess with.
Right. I mean, for those who might not be steeped in Forgotten Realms lore, what is a Mythalar?
So a Mythalar is like a huge arcane engine that channels energy of like both raw magic itself and the gods, and kind of anchors magic to the realms, allowing it to work properly. But when you find one, you can work with it and make it do things. And so the greatest cities in history have sort of had these things. So like the Elven nations have tapped into this, right? And used Mythalars to power what they do. And yeah.
So like Myth Draenor would be an example of one. Waterdeep has something like that, that protects it, like a Mythal.
Yeah.
That keeps dragons out and things of that nature.
So it bends it allows you to bend what normally is possible in a world because you have access to this.
Yep. And what about the Everlasting Rime? What do you think about that?
I love the concept of it. What I really loved when I read this part, this summary, is the words that are used, which to me read like very Perkins words, were just a beautiful way of creating these visuals. Aurel as casting this spell every day, being weakened by it. It manifests the spell. It has the presence of an aurora, right? So it's beautiful and horrible at the same time. That the people can just sense when this thing begins, that this is the presence of Aurel. And just the concept and naming of Everlasting Rime, I find it just beautifully evocative, wonderful piece of story work.
Yep. Yeah. It's all three of these are interesting in their own ways, right? There's this sort of God-driven ephemeral thing. Then there's the just straight on Duergar want to control and then there's the mysterious arcane-driven, history-driven Netherese element with the Arcane Brotherhood. So, there's different flavors of adventure, but they're all cool, and they're all things that you can really use as a DM depending on A, what you like, or B, what your players like.
Yep. And I like the use of 3 plot threads. It's kind of a nice tip of the hat to the Legacy of the Crystal Shard and those series of adventures that would use these 3 quests, 3 main plot threads. It kind of evokes that as well.
Yeah, and without digging into it any deeper, what I also like about that is you as a DM can say, my players are not going to be interested in the Durgar or Oral even, but this Netherese thing, I'm going to use that. I'm going to make my own adventures that lead up to it, and then some side quests that go off of it, but the main thread of my campaign is just going to be this.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's good design.
Yeah. Can I also say we get this sidebar that answers the question of Chardalin? Chardalin?
Yeah.
And I'm just going to quote it because I think this is a fundamental, neat lore piece to understand. More than 100 years prior to this adventure, a wizard named Akar Kessel found an artifact suffused with demonic magic called Crinshinaban, better known as the Crystal Shard, and used it to erect a great black tower in Icewind Dale. When this tower was destroyed, the magic used to create it fused with surrounding ice to form what is now known as Chardalin, a non-magical crystalline substance as strong as metal, though considerably easier to work with than steel. In the years since, more deposits of Chardalin have been found across Icewind Dale. Like the Crystal Shard, these deposits tend to be suffused with demonic magic. Prolonged contact with Chardalin that has become suffused with demonic magic can warp a creature's mind, causing madness that usually fades away once contact is broken. I mean, that just really, and then there's some additional pieces that say that you can actually suffuse it with either demonic or even celestial magic, and it can be consecrated or desecrated, which is a really neat idea.
Right.
But I love how they do this, and then they'd say, long before Carcastle left his mark on Icewind Dale, Netherese wizards created their own Chardalin. Many items made from this dark-colored crystal can be found in the ruins of ancient Netherese enclaves. Really nice way of remaking the lore and retuning it for today.
Yep, making it fit with the rule set of today and the ethos of today, but still giving a nod to what has come before. So that gives us that background on those 3 adventures and what Chardalin is. So now the next section is called Running the Adventure. And as you might imagine, this gives instruction, first of all, on just as a DM, here, this is what box text is. Here's how you should use maps, whether you're going to run a minis-based game or Theater of the Mind game. Here's the poster maps. Here's how you might use those, all sorts of things.
Yeah, in general, there's some nice guidance here. What I like is some adventures in the past for 5e have been a little shy on saying, hey, new DM, here's how to do things, and make the adventure your own, right? And this includes things like feel free to alter the map, draw your own, leave things out, add new things, make it yours. And that's important and good guidance to add.
Yeah, it is good guidance to add, and it's always tough, though, to know how much of that to give. It's one thing to say, hey, new DM, make this your own. It's another thing to tell them how.
Yeah.
And that's always the balance between those 2 extremes, because that's, even as a game designer, right? You're an adventure writer. You want the DM to do whatever they need to do to make it work for their players, rather than running it as written, because there are so many different player types and so many different wants and desires for DMs and players that you don't want it to be a straitjacket, right? You want it to be something that opens up rather than closes around them. And so giving those instructions can be important.
Yeah.
There was an interesting part where, because they're talking about this adventure specifically, how to run it, and then they give some strange Forgotten Realms sort of background. And I'm like, it's not very long, but I'm wondering if it was really needed. They talk about the Sword Coast and these 3 cities that are on the Sword Coast, which Luskin comes up a little bit in the adventure because that's where the Arcane Brotherhood is from. And some characters are described as, you might be from Waterdeep, but I didn't know if that was really needed.
Yeah. It feels a little odd there because it's not like we're going to go to Neverwinter or Waterdeep or Luskin. And
right. It was just
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe they needed a little extra text, so they threw that
That
in.
could be.
I mean, it's not terrible. It's literally 3 or 4 paragraphs, but it was just kind of strange. The next section is called Adventure Flow and Dissecting the Adventure. And these parts I think are super important, especially for newer and experienced campaign DMs. It's one thing to sit down and run a 4-hour adventure and then sit down and run a different 4-hour adventure. It's a whole other thing to DM a campaign. I would have liked to see more than just in this. They give a list of the chapters and a few sentences on what's in each. And then they give 3 paragraphs on using this if you're not in Icewind Dale. So it's kind of almost, I don't know if it needed to be said, that you could use this in your own home campaign. You could set it in this place in Eberron or this place. Yeah, you can, but that doesn't help me run it per se. So to have that in the adventure flow and dissecting the adventure section didn't seem necessary to me.
Yeah, I think I've liked it better when they put this in an appendix and gave it a little more depth and gave me some better ideas, because I mean, what is it like? What's the point if I say that this is the Yatal Mountains of Oerth and not Icewind Dale? Okay, but how do I mean, I have 10 towns and I have all these other, and I have a ragged glacier, and how do I make, what? Like you haven't really given me much guidance with this. Right.
This seems to be that thing that's often said because they feel like it needs to be said, but it doesn't really help anyone. Anyone who already knows D&D well knows they can do this because they do it all the time. They take this adventure, move it here, and make changes. But this doesn't tell how to do it. It just says you can do it. So it's that whole guidance thing again.
Yeah. I agree with you. It almost feels like like you said, the thing that they feel they must say, but it's not actually helping anyone to say this, like, because it's not a toolkit, and it's somewhere in between. It's a strange. It doesn't just say, "Hey, make the adventure your own," which I think is important to say, and you can say that in various ways, and it's worth doing. But it's almost pretending to be instruction when it's not actually instruction.
Yeah. And it's one of those things that just, as a player, as a DM, that you can do it, so you want to say it. Take the next step and say how.
Yeah.
Because that's what new DMs are going to need. They're going to need that instruction. And what do I run first? They're going to need that instruction is how do I get from chapter 1 to chapter 2 and make it work organically? Those are the things that they need to know.
Yeah. And just in general, I feel like a number of people feel this way, that we are paying you for this really cool book that is useful. Not our money is not going towards that we can then do things, right? Because we can always do that. Like that's the free part of the game. I can make my own setting or whatever, right? Like, but I want from you utility. And so whenever content is just sort of like, it acts like it's utility, but it's not, then that's kind of valueless, right? If it makes sense. And I'm not trying to be overly harsh with that, but it's sort of like,
and it's a habit that we adventure writers get into. Right. We want to be helpful, but sometimes we don't want to go to the extent of giving all the help we can, maybe because we don't have the room for it's not always laziness. It's not always trying to get out of it. It's just, we might not have the word count to do it.
Right.
So it's that balance of using every word to its utmost potential to help the person who is using this user manual that we're making. The next section is running NPC party members. This is, again, it's good, but it's very basic information. More information here. If you're going to say this, you're talking to new DMs, so be as helpful as you possibly can. Don't just say, if you have an NPC, hand it to a player to play if you get overwhelmed. That's, yes. But what about an evil NPC? What about an NPC with a secret? What about an NPC that's going to turn on the characters at some point? How do you run that? How do you run an NPC that's helpful without overwhelming things. That sort of information, especially in the context of the adventure itself, would be great.
Yeah.
And do you have anything to add to that, or is it just
No, I think it's spot on.
going off on a little rant?
This is another example of, it's just 2 paragraphs, and so it's fine, but it doesn't, there are so many hints and tips that come from how to run an NPC well as a DM. And this just sort of says, hey, give a copy to the player, let them know you might take it back. But it's not, there's so many reasons and ways to do that are really helpful advice, and it's not really giving you all of that. And so, I know there's only so much space you can use, but again, like, provide utility. And this I wouldn't really characterize this as being particularly useful.
Right. If you're going to do it, put it in the context of this adventure, or you could say, we will provide information about running certain NPCs when those NPCs are in the adventure.
Yeah. In fact, if this advice was retooled the first time an NPC that's going to travel with the players were to come up, and you were to say in a sidebar, hey, with this NPC and others, consider giving this to a player to control, so that they're more invested in it. And why, right? Because the reason you give a player control is they'll suddenly care about it more. And they will take the turns with that character carefully. They're less likely to forget it. Whereas you as DM, who's running a whole herd of monsters, you'll probably forget the NPC, but they will remember it, and they will care about it, and they might role play it. And so there are all these reasons why you're doing that. And that could go in a sidebar the first time, but apply to everybody else.
And then what are the pitfalls of doing that? Especially if the NPC is going to, like I said, turn on everyone, or something is going to be written into the adventure that happens to them that the players can't stop.
Yeah, and this kind of links in a bit to the Frozen North adventure that we talked about earlier, 10-01, that premiered this weekend. It does an interesting thing that ties into the new release, Tasha's, that's going to come out later, which provides sidekick characters. And sidekick characters are NPCs that you can run, and players could maybe run. And in the Frozen North, these sidekick characters show up, and you get a number of them, and it feels a little bit, I like the adventure a lot, but it feels a little bit like Out of the Abyss, where you have a whole horde of characters on the table now, and players are taking long terms because they've got those plus the NPCs, and there's a lot of guidance there that maybe we'll find in Tasha's, right? Because that'd be a good place for it, because it's impactful to the game, and it's impactful to the challenge of the adventure. I found it interesting in running the Frozen North. It would say things like, if your party is a strong table, and I wanted to say, are we counting the fact that you added 3 NPCs to my table? Because they're kind of strong with that. Right, exactly. It's not only that they can attack, but it's they soak up damage. Yeah. And every character you adds almost multiplies the strength of the party because of that. I could see this being an adventure where people use sidekicks, so all this might be relevant. Yeah, yep. So it's, again, not saying that what's there is bad. It's just how useful is it in the context of a new DM, an experienced DM, and what happens exactly in the adventure itself. We've been going for a while. We didn't even cover wilderness survival and all that great exploration stuff, but I think we can hit that next time. Cool. And then we'll also cover the first chapter, which is all about the 10 towns and the adventures that happen there. Awesome. I look forward to it. Whew. That was a show. Indeed it was, Sean. That was a show. Most of them are. Yeah. Yep. This was more show than normal, I think. I don't know. It felt more showy. If listeners could please let us know which is the showiest of our shows. Yes. That's what I really want to know. We will put up a poll. Which show is the showiest? But speaking of you listeners out there, thank you so much for letting us talk with you or at you or around you. And we hope you enjoy what we have to say. If you would like to be a patron of the show, we would so much appreciate that. For even $1 a month, you can get a few extras from not just us, but from 2 other shows on the Misdirected Mark Network.
Pandas Talking Games and the Misdirected Mark podcast. You can find our Patreon at patreon.com/MMP. Teos, where can people find you?
You can find me at AlphaStream on Twitter, tweeting with the tweets, or foruming at the Misdirected Mark forums, or blogging sometimes at the alphastream.org blog.
I also tweet twits at Sean Merwin on Twitter, or you can go to the forums at forums.misdirectedmark.com, talk about individual topics or individual episodes with Teos and me. Down with D&D is a Misdirected Mark production, the media arm of Encoded Designs. Hey, Teos, what do you think we should do now?
Well, honestly, what everybody should actually do is go back to the beginning where we talked about how you can get those D&D Celebration downloads and get yourself your gelatinous ice cube familiar.
Go kill some gelatinous ice cube familiars.
Get down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Get down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Get down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Who's down with D&D?
This whole party.
Down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
You down with D&D?
Yeah, you know me.
I'm down with D&D.
Yeah, you know me.
Who's down with D&D?